So hello and welcome to this special edition of The Point of View. We're very privileged to have a development finance practitioner with decades of experience working all over Africa, Dr. Frances Leutier. She's in Ghana for a special program. She's been invited by the UNU INRA at Legon to deliver a lecture to honor one of Ghana's very profound academics, Professor Alex Kwapong. And she will be speaking at the Nature Speaks lectures. We've caught up with her to try and gauge her views about development on the African continent. How does Africa rise to its great potential? Africa has lots of human resources and natural resources. How does Africa leverage those to bridge its infrastructure and funding gap? How does Africa prepare the next generation of leaders to be ready to raise the continent to where it ought to be? Doc's experience is massive. Presently, she is the COO and the Executive Director for Asset Management for the Eastern and Southern African Trade Development Bank. But that's just a little part of the story. She's worked with the African Development Bank, she's worked with the World Bank, risen to Vice President level, she's run her own organizations in the past. Doc, it's really great to have you in Ghana. Thank you for talking to us on City TV.
It's a pleasure, Bernard, to be here once again in Ghana.
For somebody who travels so much across the continent, how do you see Ghana?
Well, first I remember Ghana from my childhood because it's one of the countries that we looked up to as an example of Pan-Africanism. And as we live today, seeing all the policies that are being approved at the African Union level, I'm very proud to see that Ghana's views from all those years back are becoming now a reality. So for me, Ghana first represents Pan-Africanism. And secondly, I come here quite often. I even go to some of the rural areas. I am a family member of a small part of Agona, where I visit once in a while. And Ghana has represented to me a place where thoughts and ideas are debated, where the press is free, where democracy is alive, and also where advancement can be seen in the form of Accra itself, the way it has grown over the years I've been visiting, the infrastructure solutions, including the congestion, which is a symbol of development, and of course the Kotoka Airport, which has evolved tremendously since I started to come to Ghana. And then maybe the last area where, as a visitor to Ghana, you notice quite visibly is the quality of the hotels and therefore the touristic infrastructure. And now what you can do in Ghana, you can go to the theater, you can go to museums, you can visit and engage in part of Ghanaian history. So I think for me, Ghana represents an evolving country and a democracy that is ripe and working, and also a country that has put in place the key infrastructures to advance. So those are, but primarily for me it's the Pan-African ideal. Even when you go around the roundabout, you see how the African Union is valued in Accra.
Good. That's brilliant. For we know you're from Tanzania, and a lot of us remember the Mwalimu as well. Historically, a lot of people feel that Ghana is a shining star that has underperformed a little because we are first country sub-Saharan Africa to be independent, and we've been independent for 60-something years. In terms of advancement, how long do you think it takes for us to really assess this generation of African countries that went independent? So Ghana in 57, a lot of the African countries in the 60s. Is 50, 60 years enough to test and say we've made strides, we've performed, or is it still too early to assess how well we've done?
Well, first of all, I think it's in one way too early and in another way a bit late. And I'll give you an example of a study that was done that looked at evolution of economies and societies, and saying which is the country where you could say today has the right balance between economic prosperity, a capable state, an inclusive society, and a dynamic polity that represents the people. And when you look at the country that came up, it was Denmark. So the question was, how long has it taken Denmark to become Denmark? And it's almost 1800 years. So then the question is 60 years too short for Africa? And the answer could be yes in one way. But if you look then at countries like Japan that reconstructed after the war, or South Korea, or now even China, they've been able to grow and develop much faster. China was poorer than many African countries, was poorer than Ghana. South Korea and Ghana were at the same level of development when Ghana got independence, but Ghana has been surpassed by South Korea. So in that way, it looks like it's too short. So to me, the question is, what has Africa achieved since independence, and what remains to be done? I would say, first of all, there's been a lot of it has been very difficult for Africa to compete in a global economy, because it started entering the global economy quite late, because its earlier linkages to the global economy were through the extractive industries and trade. So it's only in the last decade and a half that Africa is really integrated in a proper way, you could say, into the global economy. So I would say in another decade or so, one should take a look and see how that has worked. So secondly, if you look at the top growing countries, economies today, looking at the IMF predictions and looking at the last decade, Africa has been dominating the top 10 in terms of the fastest growing economies. If you look at Ethiopia today, you look at countries like Cote d'Ivoire, like Tanzania, Rwanda, even Ghana has been growing very, very fast. So I think that's a good sign, because countries like China, South Korea managed to grow and develop quickly because they maintained high levels of economic growth for more than a decade. So we need to sustain that and to see how it goes going forward.
Brilliant. We'll come back to the issue of trade, but I want to look at the political. So there are some who feel that a lot of the countries that have advanced within the liberal democratic framework had the minimum economic development and literacy before they, for example, started with universal adult suffrage. But countries like Ghana, the vote was made very common, whilst we're still very underdeveloped, and a lot of people were not well educated. Some people feel that that mix has hampered our development. So whether it is Korea or China or Singapore, there is a certain system that brought economic development before the political system that we now practice. What are your thoughts on that, and whether, in a sense, the benefits of democracy have also limited the ability for, say, long-term planning, which has characterized some of the rather successful Asian economies in the past?
I think there is an African proverb that says, if you want to run fast, you can run alone, but if you want to run far, you have to run together. And I think, to me, the balance between fast economic growth and democracy is captured in that proverb. Because you can have very high economic growth without democracy, but whether it's sustainable in the long run is always a question. Because what sustains societies in the long run is inclusiveness, and democracy is the best way to guarantee inclusiveness in a society. So for me, the trade-off is not either or, but it's how you balance inclusiveness with development. And I think if you look at the examples, if I take the example of Tanzania, where I'm from, when Tanzania got independence, there were only 5 medical doctors for the whole country. So going from 5 medical doctors to reaching the levels that you have now, with a doctor for every 20 to 50 families, or maybe in some cases in the rural areas to every 100 families, still it's a huge development. In the case of Ghana, sadly there are more Ghanaian doctors in New York than in Ghana, but I think some of them are beginning to come back because the economic conditions have improved. You see huge remittances flowing back into Africa from Africans who have left. The bank that I'm working for now, the Trade and Development Bank, about 60% of our staff are returnees. We've recruited them from all over the world, brought them back to Africa, and they're agreeing to come back to work now in the conditions that we can now afford in terms of an exciting job, an opportunity for growth, real opportunity for innovation. So I think the trade-off to me is not a stark one of either or. It's how you balance the two. Countries like Tanzania and Ghana have experimented with different models. In the case of Tanzania, we took the example of villagization, which was really pushing development to the lowest common denominator, which was a household and 10 households and so on. Some countries are doing that now. They're decentralizing. So in a way, you could say the lessons learned are there. Of course, we did it without having the knowledge of history. It was an experiment, so there were some failures, but we learned from that. And when you look today, the country is a much more stable country, much more representative, more unified and peaceful. In the case of Ghana, you were able to maintain the traditional systems with the modern systems and cohabitate between those two systems, a bureaucracy and the traditional chiefdoms. And that has given Ghana ability to ingrain itself in culture, which is giving value today when you look at the fashion industry, the food industry, the creative arts, even architecture, which is able to grow on those traditional knowledge and systems. So I think the experiments are now quite visible across the world and across Africa, and now we can take off from there with what is provided now by the new economic opportunities.
There are some people who think that the African intellectual elite need to help evolve a uniquely African model, because as you rightly said, in the 70s we experimented with socialism at various forms. It didn't work. Lots of military interventions, and then a lot of us liberalized based on what the World Bank and other people said from the 90s coming forth. We did make some progress, but we're still not out of the woods yet. Now, Lee Kuan Yew says culture is destiny, and the model he created took into cognizance the culture of the people of Singapore. It seems as if we've been an experimental case for decades. Is it time we evolved a unique model which takes cognizance of our culture, our mindset, our behaviors? Is that going to be what we need to really develop the way we ought to?
I think, first of all, Africa is very rich in culture. It's a very diverse continent, so with over 2,000 languages, very rich cultural heritage, knowledge that is embedded in cultural practices that is becoming more valuable now as we discover the codependency and interdependency between human development, natural development, and overall global stability. So I believe very much in the value of leveraging culture, and I also believe in context-sensitive development. Because if you try to embed a model totally alien to the existing culture, it's very rare that it succeeds. But that being said, I'm struck by a few things. If you take, for example, how Africa adopted the cell phone, completely new technology, but it just went like wildfire, and we became really the hub of innovation. If you look at mobile payment systems in Kenya that are now ubiquitous across Africa, if you look at the way social communications happens now through social media, it's completely revolutionized the way you use these technologies. And I think it's because the technology matched the culture. We are a very oral culture with oral traditions, so we got a technology that linked up to that storytelling, and it just took off, and it allowed many other systems to grow onto it. So I think it's also a question of figuring out which one is appropriate. It may not necessarily be African. It could be from outside Africa, as the case of the mobile technology, but it could be usable, adaptable, and relevant immediately to the needs of the continent. The second example I have is the other way around, where what was evolved here is actually now being used in other parts of the world. You take the challenge of nutrition, for instance. The San people in southern Africa naturally are very slim because of what they eat. That has given rise to a huge research and commercialization of medication and aids to being slim outside of Africa. So this is where medical science and cosmetology, I don't know what the word really is, but has learned from Africa, because that was something that was naturally here in the natural diets of the people of southern Africa that has been extracted to go outside. So I think it's a question of trade-offs between local and global knowledge, having a context-specific development strategy, and embedding into the transformation process of society the types of solutions that will be carried by the wave or that will carry the transformation even further. And those examples, I think, are illustrative of that.
This is the point of view. We're having a chat with Dr. Franny Luthier. She's Tanzanian, but she's really an African citizen. She's in Ghana to speak at the Professor Alexander Kwapong Lectures, Nature Speaks, at the University of Ghana, Legon, under the auspices of the United Nations Universities Institute for Natural Resources in Africa. And we'll talk about her topics, a very interesting topic, innovation, infrastructure, technology, and the promise of new growth for natural resource management in Africa. It's quite a mouthful. But let's go back to trade, because I want to pick your views on, again, historically, we've been hewers of wood and drawers of water, and the only industries that have developed are raw material extractives. So mining developed quite well. So it would seem as if one of the keys to unlocking our economic potential is to break away from simply providing raw materials, but also becoming part of the value addition, whether it's cocoa, whether it's timber, or whether it's gold. What's missing? Why is this so hard? Because even last week, the government of Ghana was still talking about exporting timber. A lot of our growth in Ghana is gold, cocoa, and now oil, and in the raw state. What's the missing link for us to move away from simply exporting raw to being part of the value addition of these materials?
I think one of the statistics that I'll talk about tomorrow in the lecture, which really worried me, was when you look at the level of mechanization across Africa, whether it's in agriculture or in manufacturing, you see that there's been a decline in the last 4 decades. So the per square kilometer of land tilled and the agro-mechanization of that, if you look at that ratio, it's declining over time. And similarly, when you look at the export of manufactured products, they have been declining as a share of GDP out of Africa. So the question was why? I was very curious to find out why. And it turns out there are few factors that we missed as we evolved our development strategies. The first one was the real importance of a culture of repair and maintenance, because we invested in a lot of technology. We didn't plan ahead and put in place the budgetary systems to purchase the spare parts and equipment repairs that we needed. So you find all over the continent generation equipment that's not generating electricity. You find textile mills that are no longer running, railway tracks with no rolling stock, etc., etc. So this is one of the lessons learned, is that investment in maintenance and operations, which is equally important as capital investment, is one of the things that we missed in the past decades. The second thing is we were structured during the colonial times to export raw materials. Yes. And all the infrastructure that was built was supportive of that model of economic development. So it became very difficult after independence to shift, very costly to shift. And during the period of extraction of natural resources, very few skills were developed to make things. And the old skills, for example, if you go, I from this village in Agona, I have a stool, handmade stool in that village, beautifully carved. But we've forgotten those skills of how to now go from a stool to a chair, to a table, to a whole building, so that we are not importing everything like chairs, for instance. We import like 90% of the chairs that we use. And these are very basic things that used to be made in Africa before. So the skills to make things and the economies and ecosystem around manufacturing and making things also didn't grow along at the same time. And that's something that we are now addressing when you look at the number of trade schools that have opened up, the companies that are innovating around new materials and so on. But maybe the last factor is the local markets, regional markets, and the connecting infrastructures. I think that has been something that we have not done as well. We've done a lot of inside the border investments that maintain those extractive routes. So you have roads that went to ports for export, and very few roads that went to the production centers for food production, for other domestic consumption products, and the link between those and the manufacturing side. But That being said, I think it gives Africa a great opportunity now to jump ahead. Just like we did with the telephone, where we forgot about the fixed line and went straight to mobile, we can do the same thing in the industrialization process and just leave behind all those antiquated ways of making things and really take these new technologies and run with them, because we don't have the old ones, so it's very easy for us to start thinking new. And I think that would also fit naturally with the way in which societies are organized and the urban to rural coordination and integration that currently exists.
Good. So as you correctly pointed out, our economies were built to focus on trade between Africa and Europe or the West or China, and not intra-Africa trade. Some people feel that our economies are not diversified and diverse enough. So within West Africa, we're very similar. So they feel that's one of the things that need to happen, where you increase trade between Ghana, Nigeria, Senegal, Guinea, and then you make ECOWAS work better before you now focus on the various blocks and exploit the African continent. I also noticed that the East Africans seem to be doing a better job in working together as a trade bloc than West Africa. Correct me if I'm wrong. Because of what you do at the Eastern and Southern African Trade Development Bank. First point, what can we do within our regional trade blocks to increase regional trade? And number two, what can West Africa learn from East or Southern Africa to enhance this agenda of trade?
One thing I must say I admire very much about ECOWAS is the mobility aspect, because in ECOWAS you don't need to get a visa to go from one ECOWAS country to another.
Yes.
You can actually relocate and work in that economy if you have the right skills, and maybe because of language is a bit of a limitation, but it's a very minor one, given, for example, I noticed how many people in Ghana speak French and therefore can work in the neighboring francophone countries. So this is a huge plus for ECOWAS, and I think it has been a strong stabilizing factor. And similarly on the political front, when you see now how the heads of state come together to manage conflict, these two are very strong examples within ECOWAS that I think we should be very proud of. For East Africa, I think there are two sides to the story. First, historically, those were common economies. We had a common market, and then because of political differences, that deteriorated and ceased, and then now we are recreating a common market and an integrated economy, but bringing other countries in as well. Because before it was Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda, but now East Africa includes Rwanda and Burundi, and even broader with South Sudan, and perhaps even other countries that may want to join in. What is different about East Africa, I think, is the financial markets.
Okay.
So you have capital markets that can travel across borders, especially what's happening in Nairobi, becoming a strong financial center and ability then to cross. Second, I think mobility through passports was not at the same level as ECOWAS until recently, but now a number of countries you just need your national ID. You don't even need a passport to travel from one country to another within East Africa, and that is helping to speed up the integration. But perhaps the last area is one of having a vision and a set of steps of how to get there, and not rushing too fast towards integration before the two sides of economic and political integration take place. So, for example, we didn't rush very fast to create monetary union, which in the case of ECOWAS with YMU and other initiatives, there was an effort, and you have a group of countries that already are integrated, having at least a peg to a single currency. In the case of East Africa, each country went along with its own model, and only now that there's a structured approach to go towards monetary union. And the last area is, I think, we did maybe a more structured approach to cross-border infrastructure. So, for example, if you look at all the major crossing points between neighbors, they have been developed. You have one-stop shops between, if you travel from Kenya to Tanzania, you just pass through one border post. You don't need to go through the 2 stops as you did before. And I think that infrastructure investment has really helped, because it's created a real community around those border posts, with people crossing from one side to the other. And to start with, some of them were even the same people, like the Maasai, on both sides, and that has helped with integration. And I would say, lastly, both regions, Eastern Africa and Western Africa, if you look at ECOWAS, EAC, and SADC and COMESA, now really with the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, now they are all coming together. We already had the experiment with a tripartite agreement between EAC, SADC and COMESA, and I think now that can be expanded across all of Africa, because the lessons learned from that tripartite agreement were very, very useful and have fed into the thinking around how we can now go with this Continental Free Trade Agreement and the area that is now being created. Yeah.
We'll take a short break. We're talking to Dr. Franny Luthier, who is in Ghana for a very special program. And when we come back, she would give us an insight into her topic. And being an infrastructure person, indeed, her PhD and some of her studies have very strong on infrastructure. I would ask her about how do we bridge the infrastructure gap that we have on the continent. Some people think it's a finance gap, right? And we'll discuss some of the issues about technology and leapfrogging. So we're talking to Dr. Franny Luthier on The Point of View. Stay with us.
For regular news checks as they unfold, 2020 news, all day, all the time. Politics, sports, entertainment, business, and more. 2020 news. We bring you the world in 20 minutes.
Welcome back to The Point of View. Today is a special program. We're having a chat with international development finance expert who currently works with the East and Southern African Trade and Development Bank, but she's done African Development Bank, World Bank, risen to vice president levels, and she really has a sense of the pulse of the continent. She's originally from Tanzania, the country of the Mwalimu, and of course she's speaking at the Nature Speaks lecture organized by the United Nations University Institute for Natural Resources and Africa here at Legon. So Doc, thank you for being on the program. So on Thursday, the 25th, your presentation has a very long theme: innovation, infrastructure, technology, and the promise of new growth for natural resource management in Africa. Blind alleys or transformational change. What is that?
It's a very long title to make a very simple proposition.
Okay.
And it's basically to argue that Africa is very rich in natural resources, whether you look at mineral wealth, large sources of fresh water from rivers and lakes, oceans, forests, but of course it's people as well. And so the question is, how do we leverage that very rich natural wealth and use it for the well-being and happiness of Africa's people, but at the same time being mindful that Africa also serves a global purpose. For example, forests are known as the lungs of the world, so we are responsible for the breathing of the world. We also are the source of many rare earths that the whole world depends on, like cobalt and lithium, which are the drivers of the fourth industrial revolution with its dependency on technology. We are abundantly wealthy in terms of sun, therefore could evolve a completely new way of generating electricity through solar power and wind and other forms. And of course we have the wealth of close to being 2 billion people who are creative and innovative and young. So it becomes then a question of, if that's the case, do we continue the way others have done before, or what we've been doing before? and where do we see those sharp turns that we need to make so that we can actually evolve differently and sustainably. And I think talking about nature, the question is, when we are done with development, will nature still exist? So this, to me, I think is the key driver. And of course, it means balancing what we produce to extract the resources, which depends on infrastructure, what we preserve through innovation and different ways of using technology, and of course how we leverage the entire wealth of the continent by its various countries, by its various people, and by its youth. So the talk tomorrow is looking at examples of how what we have done before and what we could do differently through these opportunities that are coming up from the fourth industrial revolution.
Let's talk about infrastructure, which is your area. There's talk of a massive infrastructure gap, not just in Ghana, but Africa. Is the infrastructure problem just a finance issue, or is it also an innovation problem in terms of using, I'll give you an example. So in Ghana right now, we have bauxite. We want the Chinese to exploit the bauxite, and they're giving us $2 billion worth of roads. A lot of people feel that there are lots of innovative local ways we could provide those roads without necessarily even going to that agreement. So it's not just a money issue. How do you see the infrastructure gap, and what are the key things we need to do to bridge it as quickly as we should?
Well, the estimates show that Africa needs between $50 to $90 billion a year to meet the infrastructure gap. So it sounds like a huge amount of money and scares everybody. So the approach that I think is helpful in thinking about the infrastructure gap is to first of all look at what we need for basic day-to-day existence, and that is really infrastructure that helps us to transport food and inputs into the agricultural sector. Those have to be primary, and then infrastructure that helps us to get services like education and health to all the population, and finally infrastructure that helps us to generate new markets. If we think about these three types of infrastructure, then the figure comes down to 20 to 30 billion. Then the question becomes, what kind of infrastructure? Should we invest in roads, airports, ports, railways? All of those become trade-offs, and Africa is a huge continent, so if you think about interconnecting it through heavy infrastructure, it will be very, very expensive. So again, the question becomes, which are the main corridors, and how can we invest in those so that the trade flows, the development flows can be created, that they can then finance the rest of the connectivity. If you take the example of the United States, when they built the federal highway system just after the Second World War, that was done as a job creation program, which then became the trunk program for interconnecting the states, and it became then expanded. It took them more than 30 years to complete it. So when you look at Africa, we have Agenda 2063, where yesterday NEPAD just launched the strategy for connecting Africa through railways by 2063. And some people are saying, well, that's too far ahead. But if you think it took the United States 30 years, they were probably a little more integrated than Africa is today, because at least they were one nation. We are 54 different nations. And they had also the opportunity to do it because there was the political will immediately after the war to say, let's create jobs and reconstruct the rural economies and move beyond the industrial base that existed at that time. So I think the opportunity we have is, now we have the Continental Free Trade Agreement, and we can focus now on those key corridors which have been prioritized through NEPAD's Priority Infrastructure Development list, the PIDA list. And after that, those investments can then generate revenues that can help us do the rest. So I think if you look at the 50 to 90 billion, you can say there's a 20 to 30 billion that's priority. Let's start with that, and let's use that to generate the next phase.
I like the use of the US example because it was infrastructure but also jobs. A lot of African countries are turning to China to help build their infrastructure. Apart from the Belt and Road project, we have individual relationships with China building a lot of roads for us. One main criticism is that the Chinese don't focus on job creation for the locals. So whether it's Kenya and their rails, and the fact that they are Chinese, part of even those running the system. Some people even say that the Chinese bring even their laborers. 2 points. How should African leaders approach the China question for infrastructure? And how can we be more skillful in our negotiation to get more than simply a road or a bridge, but to integrate human development into that relationship?
I think the first thing would be to decide which are the infrastructures that we need quickly, and which ones are the ones we want to learn from and maintain into the long run, and how we get the two balanced right. Because the Chinese, one advantage that they bring is they are very fast.
Yes.
They can construct overnight something that will take us months and years to do if we use our traditional systems of labor and technologies for construction. So I think that's one area where we can really learn from the Chinese how to do scale quickly, because I think they're probably the best in the world at how you get to scale quickly. But the second thing, and this comes from an example that I observed in Rwanda, just after genocide, and Rwanda just celebrated 25 years post-genocide. Just after genocide, when they were reconstructing the country, they decided very early on first to pick the priority skills that they needed, send people out there to study, learn, and come back with those skills and bring them back into the local economy. Then they created a parallel education system in their own country, secondary, tertiary, high quality, that was generating local talent that came then to replace the skills that were initially opened up to people from outside of the country. But the third thing they did, and I think this is where support through learning from the Chinese could come in, and not only the Chinese but other investors as well, is they paired up every mission that was coming to the country with a local person who learned from that mission. And so how we are able to quickly adapt and learn and use those skills. The Chinese didn't become great overnight. They scouted the world. They still scout the world today for ideas and talent, and then they bring those ideas back home. And I think we can do the same thing. We can imitate that aspect, which has worked very well for China. And then finally, I would say we used to have these kind of strategic analysis, which we don't do anymore, which is to say, where are the best at this area? So for example, if you take Ethiopia, they did that. They looked at all the skills and said, okay, these will go to the Germans. For this will go to the Americans. For these areas will go to the Chinese, Japanese, and so on. So they were able to source expertise globally because they thought through what their strategic needs were and who was the best in the world to offer that. And I think these are other things that we can learn even as we work with the investments that are now coming in from China.
Let's talk about money, and then we'll end with technology. So I have an ECA report on Africa, and it says that African countries have had economic growth, but it's been largely natural resource driven, right? But they are having challenges with finance. So they say, for example, that although African countries' macroeconomic stance improved in 2018 with narrower current and fiscal account deficits, stable exchange rates, and lower inflation, revenue streams have narrowed since the commodity price shocks of 2014, leading to higher debt levels as countries increase borrowing to ease fiscal pressure. I want you to talk a bit about your bank and the finance question for Africa. We need money to do a lot of things. Should we think, how should we think about raising the revenues? Because we're borrowing a lot. A lot of our countries are in high risk of debt distress, and there doesn't seem to be money from anywhere else, probably except from the Middle East and China. What are your views about how African governments can get the fiscal space to really drive the development they need?
That's a really, really important question, and I think when you look at what can be done and what has been done, there's still a gap, but let's take a look at a few things. First, widening the tax base. Because African economies are almost exclusively dependent on either small and medium enterprises that generate 75% of all jobs and are responsible for about 80% of GDP. and extractive industry. So those are the two main sources of revenue for governments. So finding a mechanism by which that tax base can be widened. So you see countries that have invested in cadastre that can then introduce land taxes, countries that have now started to formalize and register small and medium enterprises so that they can benefit from knowing where the resources are, but also from contributing to the tax base. And of course, rethinking the way in which we negotiate deals for natural resource extraction and the appropriate tax revenue from that. Because if you look, there are about $50 billion a year lost from Africa through tax havens, where companies declare their taxes outside of where they are producing, and therefore the countries don't benefit from that. So thinking through those three areas, I think, is very important, and a lot of countries have already done it. Kenya, for example, now about almost 90% of its development budget is raised locally from domestic revenues, and which is a very important contribution, and many other countries are in the 60 to 70% range. So it can be done. I think the second thing, which is equally important, is to think through how you can best associate the infrastructure to the users. So if you take, for example, water, in most countries water is highly subsidized. Yet this is one of the areas where if you get a good model, you can actually get very sustainable water supply that is quality from community and cooperative-based arrangements, municipal utilities, and so on. The third one is payment systems. We've done very well in mobile payment systems. If you look at the prepaid cards for telephones, they work very well. So how can we do that for electricity, for water, and other services? Because that will generate the revenues we need for expansion. So we did it for mobile phones, which means it's possible, and therefore we can expand it to other areas. You have some innovations in countries like DRC and even in Kenya, where you have a solar-based system that are metered and people pay for electricity in a village. So those are examples where we can do more. But finally, I think it's getting the right balance between domestic borrowing, international borrowing, concessional and commercial borrowing. And this is where, for example, our bank comes in. The Trade and Development Bank invests in countries to help them manage their strategic imports and exports, and that's what we call trade finance. Okay. So whether it's food, medicine, fuel, etc., fertilizer, the top priorities in terms of import and export. Secondly, we help small companies get the pre-export finance that they may need, because many SMEs can't export because they don't have working capital. So they may produce something very good, but they can't export because they're lacking working capital. So we invest in that as well through our SME platform. Then we provide project and infrastructure finance to all the major infrastructures, and we lend to sovereign and sub-sovereign. So about 60% of our loan book goes to sovereign and 40% to non-sovereign. And in terms of trade finance, it's also roughly about the same, about 50-50 in terms of trade finance and infrastructure finance. So we are really a bank that was created for the integration of the COMESA countries, and that's the role that we play.
Right. So we're still talking to Dr. Franny Luthier, who's in Ghana to deliver a lecture, very exciting lecture at the UNU INRAP program, and we're talking about Africa's development, infrastructure, finance, trade, and the whole lot. When we come back, we'll ask her back where we started from, technology and leapfrogging. Stay with us.
For all the news, analysis, projections, and policies that affect your business, curated and delivered in a simple and timely format. Watch Business Dashboard, your most comprehensive source of business news, every weekday at 7 p.m. only on City TV. Business Dashboard on City TV is sponsored by ADB Bank, truly a Greek and more.
So, Doc, you said technology was great. You gave a good example of the whole M-Pesa mobile payments economy, and a lot more optimistic there. But there are some who say that even though technology is great, Africans are still net consumers of technology and not creators. If you go on the internet, for example, a lot of the content there is not sourced from here. We just go and watch the movies, Netflix and all those things. But apart from maybe Nollywood and a few of the new industries, we don't have enough content there. What's the key for technology becoming the accelerator, not just in consuming it, but in actually becoming a tool for our development?
I think there are a number of examples. I like to talk about examples. Take a young man from Sierra Leone, Kelvin, who is now at MIT.
Okay.
At 12 years old, he used to like music, and he wanted to play music. Obviously, they didn't have electricity, so he made his own battery. So that's innovation of a young boy in a rural setting, getting the knowledge and the technology that he needs to develop a solution. Same thing can be said of a young Ghanaian who worked on wind electricity generation through a wind turbine. So there are many examples of this kind of constant and instantaneous innovation that is then being scaled up to develop larger solutions. So that is one, and the content in that is really creative knowledge which exists in every human being, but how to tap into that. The second, I think, is one of probabilities. Okay. There's an argument being made now that if intelligence is randomly distributed, the probability of finding Einstein in Africa is close to 100% because of 2 billion people who are going to be on the continent. So there's a whole program accelerated to find the next Einstein. So it's in science, technology, innovation, training people to have the right mindset about thinking about these issues from basic principles so they can discover new things. And that's already happening. You have, for example, a very young university in Tanzania, in Arusha, which has no less than 5 years the Nelson Mandela Institute of Science and Technology there. And they already have won innovation awards. They've patented some of their innovations, and they have published more than 120 journal articles in science, technology, and engineering in less than 5 years. So that's content, because when you look at journals, you look at patents, there are very few that are labeled and listed as coming from Africa. But there are also examples of success, and we need to continue on that. Here in Accra is the home of the African Association of Universities. They collect all the theses that have been written by African students at the master's and PhD level. That's a source of content that can be leveraged for the scientific and policy world. But if you look at the social media, which is, I think, the new driver for knowledge and the big data revolution, Africa is actually a huge generator of big data. I think the challenge is whether Africa is leading in the use of big data. And here I think there's a lot of work to be done. There are some examples where that has been done effectively, for example, in managing the rhino population. We're using drones and collecting information on the population and tagging the animals and tracking them. That can be improved. There's a pothole technology for scanning and reporting on potholes in South Africa, in Johannesburg, that's working very well. You have trucks in Kenya that are fitted with sensors that send information on the unevenness of the roads, and that becomes sent into a big data pool where you can analyze it and figure out what to do. You have now blockchain solutions in agriculture that can tell you the exact soil content and water needs for a plant that can be leveraged, already working in Nigeria. So there are pockets of innovation all over, and the challenge for us is collecting them and scaling them up and finding the financing that would match that kind of innovation. And that's through bond markets, through special dedicated funds, through having private investors collaborate with cooperatives and governments in order to solve local problems, and so on. Like the carbon fund that was just launched in the case of Kenya Airways, where they get for every emission of CO2 they put aside some money, and that money goes to invest in innovation. And you find a completely organic development of garments and ornaments that's taking place that can sell globally through that. So I think content is being generated, and my big surprise was Black Panther. I mean, Black Panther to me is the source of pride, if you think about it, of African culture, African solutions for peace and conflict, African fashion. There was so much in it, governance, technology, that was taken from actual African knowledge. For example, when you look at the movie, even the quality of the soil was African soil, red and natural as it looks in many of our cities. And I think the movie shows that Africa can not only dream and create superhero type movies which are fictional, but it can actually dream by using local culture and local content that is real and existing today, that can be used to move the reality to a vision for the future.
I like the Black Panther example, and I want to end on that note in a very bizarre way. So here you have a diaspora, Africans in a diaspora, buying into Black Panther, driving it to make it a global issue. A lot of the countries we've discussed have had ways of bringing back their diaspora, whether it's the Chinese, the Indian, or the Koreans. We have a lot of them in the West and in the East. What is the key to unlocking the power of the diasporan African to come back to rebuild the continent? Because, as you said, we have more doctors in New York than we have in Accra. And I'm sure a few of them would want to come back. What are we missing? How do we get them to see rebuilding Africa as part of their unfinished business?
I think, first of all, the African diasporan community contributes a lot to Africa's development, because today remittances from Africans living abroad have surpassed development aid and even surpassed FDI in some countries. So the financial contribution is real. But in order to attract Africans back to Africa, one has to first of all secure retirements. Most people who are outside the continent are working in places where they have a retirement, and it's not sure that if they leave and come back to Africa, whether they can continue to have that retirement contribution. Our retirement systems are still very nascent, they are growing, but when you look at our social security funds, retirement funds, they are still in very early stages of development. So that's one area to focus on, so that when people come, they can continue to invest in their future, in their retirement. The second, I think, is the standards and quality of education, so that when people come back with knowledge from outside, they can integrate into a system that can leverage that knowledge and maybe take it even further. You have here in Ghana an example, Patrick, who left Microsoft to come and found the university here, Ashesi, and he's doing very well. So he was able to take his expertise and knowledge and create a university environment which he teaches not only content but also leadership, ethics and values. You have the African Leadership Academy in Mauritius that is doing the same thing with Fred Swaniker and Achaleke. So these are Africans from the diaspora who have come back. I'm a returnee myself. And so it is possible to attract if you give the right environment. I think the moment is now. An article just came out by Russell Reynolds, which is one of these search firms, HR search firms for executive teams. And they found that many, they looked mostly at the financial sector. Entities, banks and funds are looking for talent, and they're sourcing it from Africans in the diaspora, because the talent that exists already on the continent is oversubscribed. Everybody wants to grab the few that are already here. So people are coming back in order to do that. But the last thing I would say is if you have left your country, you have left for a reason, either economic or social or otherwise. So for people to come back, society has to be inclusive also and accepting. I think some of the comments when you come back, you say, well, where were you during the difficult years? If you come back to that kind of environment, it's very difficult to reintegrate. So I think being able to maintain that welcomeness, because India, China, Israel, they welcome their diasporans and they give them opportunities, they help them integrate back into society. In the case of Africa, there are very few countries. I think Nigeria has a fund which is being managed by the African Development Bank, which is actually used to help Africans that want to work in another African country, or Africans want to come back to Africa, and it gives them a grant to settle in and help them. The UN does the same thing. There's a UN program that does the same thing, and so this is really a question of how we can support families to come back. The education system for kids, health. Most of the wealthier people in Africa go outside to be treated until we can have those hospitals and schools and services and facilities, which, by the way, is happening and improving day by day. So I think it's a question of maybe a decade before we have massive returnees coming back to the continent.
So the Middle East has had its turn in medieval times. Europe has had its turn. The US is dominating. China is also threatening. Not too sure about Latin America. When will Africa's turn come? Does it follow in that sequence? Will we ever get to a stage where we will also say, this is the era of Africa?
I think the era is just beginning for Africa. Everyone says now, and when you look at the statistics, it shows that the center of gravity is moving towards Africa. One example, Addis Ababa is projected to overtake Dubai as the hub for cargo, as a cargo terminal for import and export. And it's a landlocked country.
Wow.
So I just leave you with that one example.
I like the Ethiopia example. We've been having a chat with Dr. Franny Leutier, who's a special guest of the University of Ghana, UNU, giving a lecture at the Professor Kwapong Memorial Lectures. It's been great having you, Doc. Thank you for talking to us.
Thank you, Bernard. It's been a real pleasure.
And that's all we have time for today's edition of The Point of View. Thank you for watching, and thank you for sending your messages. Till we meet next time, have a good evening.